The morning of my husband's funeral, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror with my lipstick trembling in my hand. Not because I cared how I looked, but because after 42 years of marriage, I suddenly didn't know who I was without Robert beside me. Outside the window, the sky over Columbus, Ohio, hung low and gray, the kind of cold February morning that settled deep into your bones. Snow from the night before still clung to the edges of the driveway, untouched except for the dark tire tracks from the funeral home staff who had arrived early. I stared at myself for a long moment. 70 years old, white hair carefully curled, pearl earrings Robert bought me for our 25th anniversary, black wool dress, and eyes that looked 10 years older than they had just 1 week ago. Downstairs, I heard voices, too many voices, doors opening, footsteps, forced laughter, coffee cups clinking against saucers, and Emily's voice floating above all of it, bright, cheerful, perfect, like she was hosting a brunch instead of preparing for my husband's funeral. I closed my eyes for a second. Then I heard her laugh, that sharp little laugh she used whenever she wanted people to think she was kind. "Oh no, don't worry about Diane," she told someone downstairs. "She's been very emotional. I'm trying to handle everything for her." For her, not with her. I gripped the bathroom sink so tightly my knuckles turned pale. Robert had only been gone 6 days. 6. And already I sounded like a responsibility people passed around quietly behind closed doors. I took one slow breath before walking downstairs. The house smelled like lilies. I hated lilies. Robert hated them too, but Emily had filled the entire downstairs with them anyway. Huge white arrangements crowded the dining room table and lined the entryway. The scent was so thick it almost made me nauseous. "Diane," Emily said the second she saw me. Her smile appeared instantly, practiced, controlled. She crossed the living room quickly in a fitted black dress that looked more expensive than respectful. Her blonde hair sat perfectly pinned, not a strand out of place. Meanwhile, I felt like I hadn't slept in years. "You should have stayed upstairs longer," she said softly, touching my elbow like we were close. "You need your strength today." Several women from church stood nearby, watching us. Emily always performed best with an audience. "I'm all right," I said quietly. "Oh," she gave a sympathetic little smile. "Well, if you say so." There it was, that tone, the one that made me sound fragile and unreasonable at the same time. I looked around the room. Neighbors filled the living room carrying casseroles and condolences. Men in dark coats stood near the fireplace, speaking in hushed voices about Robert's years at the steel plant. Someone sniffled softly near the staircase, and right in the center of it all stood my son, Michael. Tall like his father, gray already creeping into his dark hair, holding a cup of coffee while Emily spoke for both of them. When his eyes met mine, something inside me tightened, because he looked uncomfortable. Not heartbroken, not grieving, uncomfortable, like he already sensed something was wrong but didn't want to deal with it today. "Mom," he said finally, walking over. "How are you holding up?" Such a small question, such a distant question. I remembered when that boy used to crawl into my lap after nightmares. Now he stood 3 feet away from me, like I was a neighbor he didn't know very well. "I'm managing," I answered. He nodded quickly. Then his phone buzzed, and just like that, his attention disappeared again. Emily stepped between us smoothly. "Michael?" Pastor Reynolds texted. "The funeral home is ready early." Of course, she knew before I did. I watched them exchange a glance. Not cruel, not obvious, but something about it made me feel strangely outside my own life, like decisions were being made around me instead of with me. Emily clapped her hands lightly. "Okay, everyone, we should start heading out soon." Everyone moved instantly, like she was in charge, like she belonged at the center of this day more than I did. I said nothing. That was the strange thing about grief. People expected screaming, crying, breaking down. But sometimes grief just made you quiet enough to notice things you should have seen years ago. I noticed how Emily directed the funeral home staff before speaking to me. I noticed how she corrected small details about Robert's service without asking my opinion. I noticed my son letting her. And worst of all, I noticed how natural it all seemed to them, as if they'd already rehearsed life without Robert. The drive to the funeral home felt endless. Snow blurred past the windows while old gospel music played softly through the speakers. Emily sat in the front passenger seat beside Michael, while I sat alone in the back. Not one of them turned around the entire ride. At one point, Emily lowered the music and sighed dramatically. "I just hope today goes smoothly," she said. Michael nodded. "It will. There's already been so much stress." Something about the way she said stress made me look up. Then she glanced at me through the mirror, just for half a second, and smiled. Small, tight, careful, like the sentence had been meant for me. I looked away toward the snowy streets. Robert used to hold my hand during drives, even after 40 years, especially after 40 years. The memory hit me so hard, my chest physically hurt. By the time we arrived at the funeral home, the parking lot was already crowded. People gathered near the entrance in black coats and scarves, speaking in low, respectful voices. The American flag beside the building snapped sharply in the winter wind. As soon as Michael parked, Emily moved fast, too fast. She stepped out immediately, smoothing her coat before walking toward the entrance, where several relatives waited. And suddenly, her entire face changed again. Soft grief, gentle smile, perfect daughter-in-law. "Oh, thank you so much for coming," she told people, hugging them delicately. "She's holding up as best she can," she whispered loudly enough for others to hear. She, not Diane, not my mother-in-law, just she, like I wasn't standing 10 feet away. One of Robert's old friends approached me quietly, Frank Wilson, 78 years old and still wearing the same heavy denim jacket he'd worn for 20 years. His eyes softened when he saw me. "Diane," he said gently, "I'm so sorry." That nearly broke me, not because of the words, but because he spoke to me directly, like I still existed. I squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Frank." He leaned closer. "Robert talked about you constantly, you know." I swallowed hard. Before I could answer, Emily appeared beside us. "There you are," she said brightly. "People are looking for immediate family inside." Immediate family. The word sat strangely in the air. Frank frowned slightly. I noticed it. Emily noticed it too, but her smile never moved. "Well," Frank said slowly, stepping back, "I'll see you in there, Diane." Emily waited until he walked away. Then her expression cooled just a little. "We should go in now," she said quietly. Not rude, not warm, controlled. Everything with Emily was controlled. Inside, the funeral home glowed with soft amber lighting and polished wood. The smell of flowers hit me immediately again. Lilies, roses, fresh greenery. Too much of everything. At the front of the room stood Robert's casket beneath framed photographs from our life together. Our wedding picture, fishing trips, Christmas mornings. One photo of us dancing barefoot in the kitchen 20 years ago. My breath caught painfully. For one fragile moment, none of the tension mattered anymore. I just missed my husband. I moved slowly toward the front. But then something stopped me cold. The seating arrangement. Front row, 3 seats. Michael, Emily, and their daughter Ava. I blinked. Surely there had to be some mistake. I looked again carefully. No 4th seat. No place for me. At first, I honestly thought maybe the funeral home staff had simply forgotten. But then I noticed something worse. My printed memorial booklet sat alone, farther back. 3rd row, end seat, like an afterthought. A strange ringing filled my ears. I looked around slowly. People were still entering, talking quietly, removing coats. Nobody else seemed to notice yet. Then Emily appeared beside me again, and the second I looked into her eyes, I knew. This wasn't a mistake. "Oh," she said softly, pretending surprise. "You saw the seating." My throat tightened. "I think there's been some confusion." "No confusion," she replied smoothly. Then she lowered her voice. "The front row is really for immediate family." For a second, I genuinely thought I misheard her. I stared at her face. This woman standing in front of me at my husband's funeral, was calmly explaining why I didn't belong beside him. I was married to Robert for 42 years, I whispered. Emily gave a tiny sigh, the kind people use with difficult children. And nobody's denying that, Diane. Diane, not Mom. Never Mom unless people were watching. But today is already emotional enough, she continued softly. We just thought it would be simpler this way. We, not I. We, meaning Michael knew. My own son knew. I looked toward him instinctively. He stood near the casket speaking to Pastor Reynolds, and he would not look at me, not once. That hurt more than Emily ever could. Behind us, I sensed movement. People were beginning to notice the tension. A cousin paused mid-step. One of the churchwomen looked between us uncertainly. Emily saw it too, and instantly her expression changed again. Concerned, gentle, public. She touched my arm lightly. Why don't we sit somewhere quieter, where you'll be more comfortable? Comfortable, like I was old furniture being moved out of sight. My face burned, not from anger, from humiliation, the slow, suffocating kind. I suddenly became aware of every tiny sound in the room, programs rustling, shoes against carpet, muted whispers, and underneath all of it, silence, the dangerous kind, the kind where people pretend not to stare while staring anyway. I looked at the empty front row seat beside Emily, then at the third row seat waiting for me like a punishment, and for one terrible moment, I almost cried. Not because of the chair, because Robert would have hated this. He would have stood up immediately. He would have said, "My wife sits beside me." Always, every single time. But Robert wasn't here anymore, and somehow everyone already seemed to understand that. Everyone except me. Emily leaned closer, still smiling, still performing. I think this is best for everybody. That sentence told me everything. Not best for me, best for everybody. Meaning I had become the problem, the inconvenience, the emotional burden people needed managed. I looked around the room one more time. Then slowly, I nodded and moved toward the back without saying another word. But as I passed the rows of staring faces, I noticed something strange. People didn't look sympathetic toward Emily. They looked uncomfortable, confused, even disturbed. And suddenly, for the very first time that morning, I realized Emily may have made a mistake she didn't fully understand yet. The service hadn't even started, and already the room was beginning to turn. I could feel people staring before I even reached the third row. Not openly, not rudely, but in that careful American way people look at tragedy when they know something uncomfortable is happening, and they're praying someone else fixes it first. My heels sank softly into the thick burgundy carpet as I walked past the empty front row seat that should have been mine. Every step felt unnatural, heavy, like I was walking through somebody else's funeral instead of my husband's. Behind me, I heard programs rustling. Someone coughed awkwardly, and somewhere near the back, a woman whispered, "Wait, isn't that Robert's wife?" I kept my eyes forward. If I looked at anyone right then, I might have broken. So I sat down quietly in the third row, exactly where Emily had placed me, alone. The seat cushion felt cold beneath me. In front of me, Michael sat beside Emily without turning around once. Not once. I stared at the back of my son's gray suit jacket and suddenly remembered the first time I bought him one. He was 12 years old, his first school dance. Robert had laughed because Michael kept complaining the tie felt like a leash. I almost smiled remembering it. Almost. But then Emily leaned toward him and whispered something into his ear. And he nodded. Just nodded. Like this entire situation was normal. My chest tightened so sharply I had to inhale slowly through my nose to steady myself. This wasn't just Emily anymore. That realization settled into me piece by piece. Michael knew. Michael allowed this. Maybe that should have shocked me more than it did, but grief has a strange way of dragging old memories to the surface. Little moments, little warnings, things you ignored because love makes excuses long after it should stop. I remembered Thanksgiving 3 years earlier when Emily joked that older people take up too much emotional space during holidays. Everyone laughed awkwardly, even Michael. I remembered Christmas dinner when Emily rearranged seating so her friends sat closer to the fireplace, while Robert and I ended up near the kitchen. Again, Michael said nothing. And now here I was, at my husband's funeral, being treated like an optional best. The organ music began softly near the front. Conversations lowered immediately. People shifted into their seats. The funeral director moved quietly near the aisle with that calm, professional expression funeral directors always wear. But the tension hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had spread. I could feel it moving through the room in silent waves. People had noticed, especially the older women. Church women notice everything. 2 rows ahead of me, Carol Bennett turned slightly in her seat and gave me a confused look. Carol and I had taught Sunday school together for nearly 15 years. Her brows furrowed. She glanced toward the front row, then back at me. I gave her the smallest smile possible, the kind women give each other when they're trying not to embarrass someone publicly. But Carol's expression only deepened, because she understood, at least partly. The service began with prayer. Pastor Reynolds stepped to the podium, his deep voice filling the room warmly. "Robert Hastings was a good man," he said gently. That nearly undid me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Robert was good, steady, kind. The kind of man who tipped waitresses too much and fixed neighbors' fences without being asked. The kind of man who still reached for my hand in parking lots after 40 years of marriage. I lowered my eyes quickly before tears could spill. In the front row, Emily dabbed delicately at the corner of her eye with a tissue. Perfectly timed, perfectly graceful. And somehow that hurt too, because she knew exactly how to perform grief publicly. Then Pastor Reynolds began speaking about family, about loyalty, about devotion across decades of marriage. As he spoke, several people slowly turned toward me. Not Emily, me. I saw it happening one glance at a time. And Emily noticed too. Her posture stiffened slightly, just slightly. She crossed one leg over the other and folded her hands tighter in her lap. That tiny reaction told me more than words could. She cared what people thought, very much. A sudden memory flashed through my mind. 6 months earlier, Emily standing in my kitchen while Robert grilled burgers outside. "You know," she'd said casually while scrolling through her phone, "people our age just handle family differently." I'd smiled politely. "What do you mean?" "Well," she shrugged, "we don't really believe in making parents the center of everything forever." At the time, I thought it was generational difference. Now I realized it had been a warning. Pastor Reynolds invited family members to share memories. Emily stood immediately. Of course she did. She walked to the podium slowly, one hand pressed dramatically over her chest. The room quieted. "I was blessed to know Robert for 22 years, she began softly. Her voice trembled perfectly. "He welcomed me into this family from the very beginning." I stared at the side of her face, at the carefully controlled sadness, and suddenly I wondered how many people in this room actually knew her, really knew her. Emily spoke about Robert teaching her how to grill steaks, helping with home repairs, walking Ava to school. People smiled softly. A few chuckled. Then Emily paused, and something shifted. "I know these past few years haven't always been easy on the family," she said carefully. My stomach tightened immediately. What was she doing? But Robert always believed in protecting peace inside the home. A strange silence settled across the room. Not dramatic, subtle, but noticeable. Even Pastor Reynolds blinked slightly. Emily smiled sadly into the crowd. "And I know that's what he would have wanted us to continue doing." There it was again, that hidden meaning beneath her words. I saw several people glance toward me instinctively, like they suddenly sensed a story underneath the story. My face burned hot, not because she'd accused me directly, because she'd implied something, publicly, without saying it outright. It was manipulative enough that nobody could challenge her, but sharp enough that everybody felt it. When she returned to her seat, Michael squeezed her hand proudly. Proudly. I looked away before he could see the hurt on my face. Then something unexpected happened. Frank Wilson stood up. Slowly. Painfully. The old man's knees clearly bothered him, but he stood anyway. "I knew Robert 47 years, Frank said gruffly. His deep voice cut through the room differently than Emily's had. Less polished, more real. He talked about one person more than anybody else. Frank turned his head slightly. Toward me. His wife. The room went very still. I felt my throat tighten instantly. Frank continued. That man loved Diane more than anything God ever gave him. Emily's smile froze. Only for a second. But I saw it. So whatever else gets said today, Frank added carefully, that's the truth I'll remember. Silence. Heavy silence. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody even shifted in their seats. Because suddenly everyone understood there was tension in this family they hadn't fully noticed before. Emily lowered her eyes quickly. Michael stared at the floor. And for the first time all morning, I saw discomfort flicker across his face. Real discomfort. Frank nodded once toward the casket before sitting down again. I wanted to thank him, but I physically couldn't speak. The emotional pressure inside my chest felt too enormous. The service continued, but the atmosphere had changed. People were paying attention now. Not openly, but carefully. Every glance between Emily and me suddenly carried weight. Every silence lasted a little too long. Even the funeral director seemed uneasy. At one point during a hymn, I noticed Carol Bennett lean toward another churchwoman and whisper something, while subtly gesturing toward the seating arrangement. The other woman frowned immediately. Then both of them looked toward me with visible sympathy. Emily saw that too. I knew she did, because her jaw tightened. Just briefly. Tiny cracks. That's what I started noticing. Tiny cracks in the perfect image she'd worked so hard to build. When the final prayer ended, people slowly began standing. Chairs shifted softly. Coats rustled. The room filled with low murmurs again. I stayed seated for a moment, needing a second to study myself emotionally. That's when I overheard it. Two women behind me. Quiet whispers. Can you believe she put his wife back here? I thought maybe Diane chose it herself. No. Look at her face. A long pause followed. Then the second woman whispered something that made my pulse stop for half a second. Robert would never have allowed this. I closed my eyes briefly, because that was exactly the truth. Robert would never have allowed it. Not in a million years. As people began filing slowly toward the reception hall, I stood carefully and reached for my purse. That's when Pastor Reynolds approached me quietly. His expression looked troubled. Diane, he said gently, may I walk you downstairs? The question itself startled me. He lowered his voice slightly. I just wanted to check on you. There it was again, that subtle concern, that growing awareness spreading through the room. I forced a small smile. That's very kind. But before we could take more than 2 steps, Emily appeared beside us, again, always appearing. Oh, Pastor, she said warmly, thank you so much for today. Her voice flowed smoothly into the conversation, like nothing uncomfortable had happened all morning. But Pastor Reynolds didn't respond quite as warmly this time. I noticed that immediately. His smile looked polite now, measured. Emily must have noticed too, because she quickly slipped her arm through Michael's. We should start greeting guests downstairs, she said. Michael nodded automatically, still refusing to look directly at me. And suddenly something cold settled into the pit of my stomach, because for the first time all morning, I realized this wasn't only about humiliation. There was something else underneath all of it, something Emily seemed strangely determined to control before anyone could question her. Then I noticed her glance toward Robert's closed office door near the hallway. Just one quick look, but it was enough. And in that exact moment, I began to suspect my husband's funeral wasn't the only thing Emily had been planning this week. By the time we entered the reception hall downstairs, I already understood something painful. People were no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with questions, and questions are dangerous in families that survive on appearances. The church fellowship halls smelled like coffee, baked ham, and lemon bars. Folding tables lined the walls beneath soft yellow lights, covered in white tablecloths Emily had personally chosen. Of course she had. Everything today carried her fingerprints. Not Robert's, not mine. Hers. Guests moved quietly around the room, balancing paper plates and coffee cups, while soft instrumental hymns played through ceiling speakers. The atmosphere should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt strained, like everyone sensed tension sitting beneath the polite conversations. I stayed near the back for a few minutes, pretending to study the framed photo display beside the dessert table. Pictures of Robert through the years. Robert fishing with Michael at age 8. Robert teaching Ava how to ride a bicycle. Robert standing beside me at Niagara Falls 20 summers ago, both of us sunburned and laughing. My fingers brushed the edge of the frame gently. That trip had cost us nearly all our savings at the time, but Robert insisted we go anyway, because I'd spent years putting everyone else first. You deserve memories too, he told me. The memory hit so hard I had to look down before my face crumpled completely. Diane? I turned slowly. Carol Bennett stood beside me, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Her eyes looked softer now than they had upstairs. Kinder. Careful. I thought you might want this, she said quietly. I accepted the cup with both hands. Thank you. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Carol glanced toward the crowded center of the room, where Emily stood laughing lightly beside several relatives. She certainly seems busy today. The sentence was polite, but underneath it sat something else. Disapproval. I noticed it immediately. I gave the smallest shrug possible. Emily likes to stay organized. Carol's mouth tightened. Again, silence. Then very gently she asked, "Are you all right, Diane?" That question nearly destroyed me, because nobody in my own family had asked it sincerely all day. Not really. I nodded quickly before emotion could climb into my throat again. I'm just tired. Carol studied me for another second, like she knew I was lying. But before she could respond, Emily's voice floated across the room. There she is. Heads turned instantly. Emily approached us smiling brightly with one manicured hand resting on Michael's arm, always attached to him, always presenting unity. Diane, she said warmly, people have been asking where you disappeared to. Disappeared, like I'd wandered off accidentally, not been pushed aside publicly at my husband's funeral. Carol's expression cooled slightly beside me. I noticed Emily noticing that too. Interesting. You should come sit with the family, Emily continued. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. Family. Now suddenly I was family again, because people were watching carefully downstairs. I'm all right here, I said softly. Emily's smile held, but barely. Oh, don't be silly, she said lightly. You shouldn't isolate yourself today. Michael finally looked at me then, and for one tiny moment, I saw guilt. Real guilt. It flickered across his face so quickly, most people wouldn't have noticed. But mothers notice everything about their children, even when those children are 50 years old. I'm fine, Michael, I told him quietly. He opened his mouth slightly, like he might finally say something meaningful, something protective, something human. But Emily squeezed his arm gently before he could speak, and whatever thought he had disappeared immediately. That hurt worse than the funeral seating, because I suddenly realized something terrifying. My son had become emotionally trained to follow her cues before his own conscience. The realization sat heavy inside my chest all afternoon. As more guests arrived downstairs, I noticed the atmosphere shifting in subtle ways. People approached me privately now, not Emily, me. Robert's old coworkers, neighbors, church members. Each interaction carried a strange undercurrent, as if they'd all witnessed something upstairs they couldn't fully process. Frank Wilson shuffled over eventually, with a plate of cookies in one hand. You eaten anything? He asked gruffly. I smiled faintly. Not hungry. Well, he handed me a napkin anyway. You should pretend. That almost made me laugh for the first time in days. Frank lowered himself carefully into the chair beside mine with an old man's exhausted sigh. Then quietly, without looking directly at me, he muttered, Robert would be furious right now. My throat tightened instantly. Across the room, Emily laughed loudly at something one of her cousins said. Perfect posture, perfect grief, perfect control. Frank followed my gaze. She always did like attention. I glanced at him quickly. There it was again, another crack. Another person quietly acknowledging what I'd spent years trying not to see. "You noticed?" I asked before I could stop myself. Frank snorted softly. "Honey," he said, "half this room noticed." The words stunned me. Half this room. All this time I'd convinced myself maybe I was too sensitive, too emotional, too old-fashioned. But suddenly I began wondering if everyone else had seen Emily clearly long before I allowed myself to. And that thought frightened me. Because if others noticed, then what exactly had Michael ignored all these years?
My eyes drifted toward my son again. He stood near the buffet table while Emily spoke animatedly beside him. Occasionally, she touched his chest lightly while talking, little gestures of control disguised as affection. I'd seen that pattern for years. Emily never argued publicly. That was the clever part. She influenced quietly, corrected subtly, redirected gently, until eventually Michael started believing her thoughts were his own. The first time I truly felt it was 12 years ago, right after Ava was born. Emily had called me crying because the baby had an ear infection and Michael was traveling for work. I drove 40 minutes through snow at midnight to help, spent 3 straight nights sleeping on their couch, cooked meals, cleaned bottles, rocked Ava until sunrise, while Emily cried from exhaustion. On the 4th morning, I overheard Emily talking on the phone with her sister in the kitchen. "I swear," she whispered, laughing softly, "Michael's mom acts like she's the third parent sometimes." I remember freezing in the hallway holding a load of baby laundry. Third parent. Not helpful. Not loving. Not generous. Intrusive. That was the first time I felt unwanted in their home. But not the last. Still, I stayed. Because that's what mothers do. We stay long after appreciation disappears.
A loud burst of laughter suddenly pulled me back to the present. Emily stood near the center table now, telling some story dramatically, while several guests listened politely. Then I heard my name. My stomach tightened immediately. "She means well," Emily was saying with a careful smile. "Diane just gets very emotional sometimes." A few people shifted uncomfortably. "She's had trouble letting Michael go over the years." There it was again, that subtle rewriting of reality. Not enough to sound openly cruel, just enough to plant an idea. An older woman beside Emily frowned slightly. I recognized her immediately. Margaret Lewis, Robert's cousin from Cincinnati. Margaret had always been sharp, too sharp for manipulation. "Well," Margaret said calmly, "most mothers don't stop loving their children just because they become adults." The room went awkwardly quiet. Emily blinked once, still smiling, but tighter now. "Oh, of course," she replied quickly. "That's not what I meant." But it was exactly what she meant. And for the first time all day, someone challenged her publicly. Small, polite, but enough. I saw Michael glance nervously between them. Emily laughed softly and changed the subject immediately, yet the damage lingered. People were watching more carefully now, noticing more, questioning more, and Emily knew it. I could tell because she started hovering closer to Michael afterward, closer to conversations, closer to control, like she was afraid of losing the narrative she'd built. That realization sat uneasily in my stomach, because normal people don't work this hard to manage appearances at funerals, unless they're hiding something. About an hour later, I finally stepped into the hallway alone to breathe. The noise inside the fellowship hall had started overwhelming me. I leaned briefly against the cool wall near Robert's office door. The church had allowed funeral families to use the small office privately during services for decades. Robert and I had sat inside that very room after his father's funeral 20 years earlier. I reached for the doorknob absent-mindedly. Locked. Strange. I frowned slightly. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Quick footsteps. Emily. "Oh," she said sharply when she saw me near the office. Too sharply. Then her face rearranged itself instantly into calm politeness. I didn't realize anyone was out here. Something about her voice had changed. Not warm. Alert. "I just needed some air," I replied quietly. Her eyes flicked toward the office door for half a second.
Tiny movement, but enough. That room's being used for storage today, she said quickly. Storage? At a funeral reception. Inside a locked office. My stomach tightened slowly. Then she added something even stranger. Michael and I already handled all Robert's paperwork. Already handled. 6 days after his death. The hallway suddenly felt colder. What paperwork? I asked carefully. Emily smiled again. Too fast. Oh, you know, bank things, insurance things, just practical matters. Practical matters. Robert handled every financial detail personally for 42 years. And suddenly everything was already handled. Without me?
Before I could ask another question, Michael appeared at the end of the hallway. There you are, he said to Emily first. Not me, her. I've been looking everywhere. Emily relaxed instantly once he arrived. Then she slipped her arm through his again and gave me one final polished smile. You should come back inside, Diane. People are asking about you. As they walked away together, I stood frozen near the locked office door. My heart beat harder now. Not from grief this time, from instinct. A wife knows when something feels wrong. And in that moment, I realized Emily wasn't just trying to push me out emotionally. She was trying to position me outside something much bigger, something involving Robert, something they thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late.
By the middle of the reception, I realized something had changed in the room. People were no longer pretending not to notice. The whispers had started. Quiet at first, polite, careful, but growing. I stood near the coffee station, stirring cream into a cup I still had no intention of drinking, when I heard my name behind me. Did you see where they seated Diane? I froze instinctively. 2 women from church stood near the wall, arranging sugar packets onto tiny plastic trays. They lowered their voices the second they noticed me nearby, but not fast enough. I just think it's strange, one whispered. She was his wife, the other replied softly. My chest tightened painfully, not because they pitied me, because they were right. For 42 years, I had slept beside Robert, cared for him through surgeries, worked double shifts beside him when money was tight, raised our son with him, and somehow, at his own funeral, I'd been treated like distant extended family. I stared down into my untouched coffee. The surface trembled slightly in my hands, not from weakness, from restraint. Across the room, Emily stood beside the buffet table, smiling gracefully while speaking to Pastor Reynolds and several cousins from Michael's side of the family. She looked immaculate, controlled, elegant, like the grieving daughter-in-law from a Hallmark movie. But now that people had noticed the cracks, I couldn't stop seeing them either. The way her smile vanished whenever she thought no one was looking, the way she monitored conversations constantly, the way her eyes kept drifting toward me anytime guests gathered nearby. Emily wasn't relaxing, she was managing, and the harder she tried to manage the room, the more obvious it became. I felt someone approach beside me. Margaret Lewis, Robert's cousin, 73 years old, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and impossible to fool. She accepted a coffee from the refreshment table before leaning slightly closer to me. Mind if I stand here? She asked. Of course not. For a moment, we stood silently together, watching the room. Then Margaret spoke quietly without looking at me. Emily certainly enjoys being in charge. There was no softness in her tone, no confusion, just observation. I let out the faintest breath through my nose. She's organized, I answered automatically. Margaret glanced sideways at me, and I immediately realized how pathetic that sounded. Still defending her, still protecting the people humiliating me. Margaret stirred her coffee slowly. You know, she said calmly, Robert called me 3 months ago. That made me look at her immediately. He did? She nodded. He sounded worried. A cold sensation moved slowly through my stomach. About what? Margaret hesitated. That hesitation changed everything, because suddenly I understood this wasn't casual conversation anymore. She lowered her voice even further. He didn't say much directly. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Michael and Emily. But he mentioned tension over finances. Finances. The word landed heavily inside me. Robert almost never discussed money with extended family. Never. Not unless something truly bothered him. What kind of tension? I asked carefully. Margaret gave a tiny shrug. He just said he was beginning to feel pressured. Before I could ask another question, Emily's laugh rang loudly across the room again. Both of us looked over instinctively. Emily now stood with Ava near the dessert table while several guests complimented the framed photo slideshow she'd arranged. "Oh, Emily did everything," one woman said warmly. "She's been incredible through all this." Emily lowered her eyes modestly. "We're just trying to hold the family together." Hold the family together. Something about that phrase made my skin crawl, because suddenly I realized what she was doing. She wasn't just presenting herself as helpful. She was quietly positioning herself as the emotional center of the family, the stable one, the capable one. And by comparison, what did that make me? Old, emotional, fragile, difficult? The realization made me feel physically cold. Margaret must have sensed it because her voice softened slightly. "Diane," she said quietly, "don't let anyone make you feel invisible today." That sentence nearly shattered me. I looked away quickly before tears formed. Not because I was weak, because kindness feels unbearable when you've been emotionally isolated long enough.
Across the room, Michael finally noticed Margaret standing with me. His expression tightened instantly. Not angry, nervous. Then Emily turned and followed his gaze. The second she saw us together, her smile faltered. Tiny, brief, but enough. And then something happened that made the entire room suddenly shift again. Frank Wilson approached Michael directly. I watched it unfold from across the hall. Frank stood tall despite his age, hands shoved into the pockets of his old brown coat. Michael straightened awkwardly the moment he approached. The conversation started quietly. Then Frank said something that visibly changed Michael's face. Michael glanced toward me immediately afterward, then toward Emily, then down at the floor. Emily stepped closer quickly, inserting herself into the conversation. Frank didn't back away. Even from across the room, I could see tension settling into all three of their faces. People nearby noticed too. Conversations began slowing, eyes drifting. The room was becoming socially aware in that uniquely American church community way, polite on the surface while silently tracking every emotional movement underneath. Emily laughed suddenly, too loudly, too quickly, trying to break tension. But it didn't fully work this time. Frank walked away first, and Michael looked shaken afterward. Emily leaned close to him immediately, whispering sharply into his ear. Not lovingly, directing, controlling. My stomach twisted again, because my son didn't look like a husband in that moment. He looked like a man trying desperately to avoid conflict. I'd seen that expression before, when he was 12 and broke the neighbor's window, when he failed a college class and hid it for weeks. Michael hated confrontation, always had, and Emily knew exactly how to use that weakness. A little later, I stepped toward the hallway restroom just to escape the growing emotional pressure in the room. As I passed the corner near the coat rack, I slowed suddenly. Voices. Low voices. Two of Michael's cousins talking quietly. "I'm telling you, something feels off." "I know." That seating thing upstairs was unbelievable. "She's acting like Robert was her husband." A long pause followed. Then one cousin whispered something that made my pulse spike. "You think this has to do with the house?" Silence. Then, I heard Michael's been talking about selling it. I stopped breathing for a second. Selling it? No. Robert and I had lived in that house 38 years. He built the back deck himself, planted every maple tree along the driveway with his own hands. We had never discussed selling it. Never. My heart started beating harder now. The cousins continued whispering. "I just think it's weird everything's happening so fast." Well, Emily's always been obsessed with upgrading houses. A nervous laugh followed. Then footsteps approached, and both women immediately changed the subject. I kept walking before they noticed me standing there, but my legs suddenly felt weak beneath me. Selling the house? Without even speaking to me? The hallway seemed narrower now, the funeral reception noisier, more suffocating. I stepped into the restroom and locked myself inside a stall just to breathe. My chest rose unevenly, not from grief this time, from realization. Tiny pieces were starting to connect in ways I didn't like. The funeral seating, the locked office, the rushed paperwork, the whispers about finances, and now the house. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead. Had this started before Robert died? The thought made me feel physically ill. A memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Robert sitting quietly at the kitchen table late at night, silent, distracted. I'd asked him what was wrong. He smiled faintly and said, "I'm just thinking about making sure you're protected." At the time, I assumed he meant emotionally. Now I wasn't so sure. When I returned to the fellowship hall, the atmosphere had shifted again, subtly, but undeniably. Guests who once crowded around Emily now seemed more spread out, more cautious. Meanwhile, people kept approaching me quietly, checking on me, touching my arm gently, offering condolences directly. Emily noticed every single interaction,
and with each one, her composure slipped a little more. At one point, she interrupted a conversation between me and two church friends by appearing suddenly beside us with that same polished smile. "There you are," she said lightly. One of the women, Joanne Miller, looked directly at Emily and asked, "Why was Diane seated alone earlier?" The room around us seemed to pause. Emily blinked once, just once, but this time, she didn't recover immediately. "Oh," she laughed softly, "there was some confusion with the seating arrangement." Confusion? Joanne didn't look convinced. "Well," she replied carefully, "it seemed hurtful." Silence. Pure silence. Even Michael looked frozen beside Emily now, and for one breathtaking second, I thought my son might finally speak, finally defend me, finally act like Robert's son. Instead, Michael stared at the floor and muttered, "Let's not make today harder than it already is." That was it. That was all he gave me. My humiliation became an inconvenience. My pain became conflict management. I felt something inside me go very still, not broken, still, like the final piece of denial quietly died. Emily exhaled visibly beside him, relieved he'd protected her again. But the people around us noticed. Oh, they noticed. Joanne's expression changed instantly. Disappointment. Not toward me, toward Michael. And suddenly I understood something deeply painful. The room was beginning to lose respect for my son. Not because of Emily, because of his silence. As guests slowly turned away from the awkward interaction, I looked across the crowded fellowship hall toward Robert's photograph near the memorial table. He was smiling in the picture, warm, steady, safe. And in that moment, surrounded by whispers and fake sympathy and growing tension, I realized something terrifying. Robert had known this family was changing long before I did, and somehow I was beginning to suspect he'd already prepared for it. The moment I heard Emily mention moving forward, the room changed again. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one of those quiet emotional shifts people feel before they fully understand why. I stood near the memorial photo table, pretending to straighten one of Robert's framed pictures, while guests slowly finished their coffee and casseroles around me. The reception had stretched into late afternoon now. Outside the fellowship hall windows, the Ohio sky had turned darker, heavy with incoming snow. Inside, the warmth felt artificial, forced, like everyone was trying too hard to keep the day emotionally manageable, especially Emily. She stood near the center table holding court again, always at the center, always speaking slightly louder than necessary, and now that people had started noticing her behavior, I could tell she was overcompensating. Michael stood beside her silently while she spoke with several relatives about family logistics. That phrase alone made my stomach tighten. Family logistics, as if Robert's death were a scheduling inconvenience. I tried not to listen. I really did. But then Emily laughed softly and said, "Well, eventually we'll need to simplify things anyway." Several heads turned toward her. One cousin asked carefully, "Simplify what?" Emily shrugged lightly. "Oh, you know, responsibilities, property, maintenance. Diane's house is just too much for one person now." My fingers froze against Robert's photograph. Diane's house. Not Robert and Diane's home. Not the family home. Not even my house. Just a problem to manage.
Across the room, Margaret Lewis slowly lowered her coffee cup. Frank Wilson stopped mid-conversation. Even Pastor Reynolds looked uncomfortable. But Emily kept smiling, completely unaware she was pushing too far. Michael shifted awkwardly beside her. "Emily," he muttered quietly, but she touched his arm immediately and continued, "We've already been discussing what makes the most sense long-term. We, again that word, always we, like decisions were already happening without me." A strange silence spread through nearby conversations. People weren't openly staring yet, but they were listening now, closely. I kept my face calm, even though my pulse had started pounding, because suddenly I remembered something Robert said 4 months earlier. We'd been sitting on the back porch watching leaves fall across the yard. He'd looked out toward the maple trees quietly and said, "Promise me something." I smiled. "What?" "If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone pressure you out of this house." At the time I laughed softly, telling me what to do from beyond the grave already, but Robert didn't laugh. "I'm serious, Di." That memory hit differently now, much differently. Across the hall, Emily continued speaking. "The upkeep alone is exhausting," she said sympathetically,
And honestly, starting fresh would probably be healthier for everyone emotionally. Healthier for everyone. Again, always framing herself as reasonable, practical, compassionate, while quietly erasing me from decisions involving my own life. One of Robert's older cousins frowned openly now. "But Diane lives there," he said carefully. Emily gave him the patient smile. "Well, of course, for now. For now." The words landed like ice water down my spine. Michael finally looked visibly uncomfortable. "Maybe we shouldn't discuss this today," he said under his breath. Emily's smile tightened instantly. "Oh, I'm not trying to upset anyone," she replied sweetly. But she absolutely was. Not intentionally, perhaps. Worse, she thought she'd already won. That's what changed everything. Emily no longer acted cautious around me. She acted confident. Confident people reveal themselves. I stayed silent. That seemed to frustrate her most, because every cruel little implication she tossed into the room just hung there awkwardly afterward with nobody fighting back. And silence has a way of manipulation louder. Margaret approached me again quietly. "Are you hearing this?" she whispered. I nodded once, carefully, because if I opened my mouth emotionally right then, I wasn't sure I could stop. Margaret looked genuinely disturbed now. "This is inappropriate," she muttered. Not loud enough to create a scene, but enough. Enough for me to realize I wasn't imagining any of this anymore. The room felt it too. Emily suddenly laughed again and changed subjects, moving into a story about Ava's college applications. Classic Emily. Whenever tension built too visibly, she redirected the room emotionally. But the atmosphere never fully recovered afterward. Tiny pockets of whispering started everywhere, near the dessert table, near the coat rack, beside the coffee urns, and every few minutes I caught people glancing toward me with increasing sympathy. Not pity anymore. Recognition. Recognition that something ugly was happening beneath the polished funeral manners. I sat down finally near the wall because my legs had started aching. Grief exhausted the body in strange ways. Across from me, Robert's military photo from his National Guard years rested beside white lilies. I stared at his younger face quietly. Strong jaw, warm eyes, the same eyes Michael inherited. And suddenly anger slipped through my grief for the first time all day. Not explosive anger. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. Because Robert had spent decades building stability for this family. Overtime shifts, weekend repairs, missed vacations. He built that house room by room with his own hands. I remembered helping him paint the kitchen at midnight while Michael slept upstairs. I remembered clipping coupons so we could afford Michael's braces. I remembered cashing out part of my retirement fund when Michael and Emily couldn't cover hospital bills after Ava was born. We never held it over them, not once. Because family helps family. That's what Robert believed. And now here sat Emily discussing my home like a future real estate transaction before my husband had even been buried. The humiliation should have broken me. Instead, something else was beginning to happen. I was starting to observe. Really observe. And once I stopped emotionally reacting, I noticed things. Like how Emily kept glancing toward Michael before mentioning the house. Not for approval, for reassurance. Like she needed him emotionally aligned before continuing. I noticed how Michael looked increasingly pale every time inheritance or property came up. And most importantly, I noticed how nervous Emily became anytime someone asked specific questions. That mattered, because manipulative people love vague control. Details make them uncomfortable.
A little later, Joanne Miller approached me carrying a small paper plate with lemon bars. "You need to eat something," she said gently. "I'm all right." That's what women our age always say before fainting. That almost made me smile. Almost. Joanne sat beside me without asking. Then quietly she said, "I knew Robert 30 years. I nodded silently. He adored you." My throat tightened again. Joanne leaned closer, and everyone in this room knows it. I stared down at my folded hands. Do they? Yes. Simple answer. Certain answer. Then Joanne lowered her voice further, which is why people are confused. Confused. Such a polite church word for horrified. Before I could answer, a sharp burst of laughter cut across the room again. Emily, now speaking with two younger couples near the buffet table. "Well, honestly, downsizing might be the best thing for Diane eventually." Eventually. There it was again. Always talking about my future like I wasn't standing 20 feet away. One of the younger women shifted awkwardly. "That seems like a lot to think about right now," she said carefully. Emily waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Robert and Michael already talked about it before." My heart stopped for half a second. Robert and Michael already talked about it. I looked toward my son immediately. Michael's face drained of color. And in that exact moment, I knew Emily had said something she wasn't supposed to. The room noticed too. Conversation slowed instantly nearby. Frank Wilson actually turned fully around. Margaret's eyes narrowed sharply. Even Pastor Reynolds looked up from his conversation. Michael stepped toward Emily quickly. "Em," he whispered urgently. Too late. Way too late. Because now everybody was watching. Emily seemed to realize it too. She laughed nervously. "I just mean generally," she corrected quickly. "You know how families discuss these things." But Michael still looked panicked. Not annoyed. Panicked. And suddenly a terrifying possibility entered my mind. Had Robert discovered something before he died? Something serious enough to worry him? My pulse thudded hard in my ears now. Emily tried changing the subject again. But the atmosphere had shifted too far this time. People no longer looked merely uncomfortable. Now they looked suspicious. And Emily felt it. I could see it in the tension around her mouth, the quickness in her speech, the way she suddenly stayed physically closer to Michael afterward, as if she needed control back immediately.
Then came the moment that changed everything for me. Frank Wilson slowly approached Michael near the hallway entrance, while Emily spoke to guests across the room. I couldn't hear the beginning, only the end. Frank's voice, low and rough. "Your father called me last fall." Michael froze. Frank stepped closer. And he was worried. My entire body went still. Michael glanced instinctively toward Emily, then toward me, then back to Frank. "What did he say?" Michael asked quietly. Frank stared at him for a long moment before answering. He said he was putting things in order. Putting things in order. The words hit me like lightning, because suddenly I remembered something else. 6 months earlier, Robert driving alone downtown twice in 1 week, claiming he had paperwork to handle. At the time, I barely questioned it. But now every strange detail from the past year felt different. Every conversation, every silence, every worried look Robert tried to hide. My breathing turned shallow, because deep down, I was beginning to realize my husband may have seen this betrayal coming long before I ever did. And if Robert truly had put things in order before his death, then Emily was standing in that fellowship hall making plans about a house she might never touch. The moment Frank told Michael that Robert had been putting things in order, I saw fear enter my son's face for the first time all day. Real fear. Not discomfort. Not embarrassment. Fear. And Emily saw it too. She crossed the fellowship hall almost immediately, heels clicking sharply against the church tile floor, her smile already prepared before she even reached them. That smile again. The one she used whenever she needed to regain control. "What's going on over here?" she asked lightly, slipping beside Michael. Frank looked at her calmly. Too calmly. "Just remembering your father-in-law," he said to Michael. Emily laughed softly. Well, today's definitely emotional for everyone. But her eyes never left Frank's face. Watching. Calculating. Trying to determine how much he knew. I stayed where I was near the memorial table, quietly observing everything now. Something inside me had shifted over the past hour. Earlier, I'd still been emotionally drowning. Now I was beginning to understand the room, the tension, the patterns, the fear hiding beneath Emily's polished performance. And once you notice fear in someone manipulative, you can't unsee it.
Michael rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, a nervous habit he'd had since high school. "I think we should probably focus on today," he muttered. Frank nodded slowly. "You probably should." The sentence sounded simple, but it landed heavily. Even Emily seemed to feel it because her smile thinned slightly afterward. Nearby conversations had already slowed again. People weren't openly staring yet, but they were absolutely listening. Church receptions work that way. Nobody causes scenes. They simply notice everything quietly, then talk about it for years afterward. Emily suddenly clapped her hands together lightly. "Okay," she said brightly. "Who wants more coffee before things get packed up?" Too cheerful, too quick, trying to move the room emotionally again. But this time, fewer people responded. I noticed that immediately. The atmosphere had become cautious around her now, measured. People still smiled politely, still accepted coffee, still thanked her, but the warmth was fading, and Emily knew it. That's what made her dangerous. She could feel public opinion shifting before anyone spoke it aloud. I watched her move quickly between guests, over-explaining little details now, over-hosting, over-performing grief. Meanwhile, Michael looked increasingly exhausted beside her, not grieving exhausted, cornered exhausted. At one point, he caught my eye from across the room, and for just a second, I saw something almost unbearable in his expression, regret. But then Emily touched his arm again, and it disappeared. I looked away first, because I couldn't survive hoping for courage from him anymore. The church hall slowly began thinning out as older guests collected coats and prepared to leave before the weather worsened. Snow had started falling outside now in soft gray sheets. Pastor Reynolds stood near the entrance thanking people for coming, while the church ladies packed leftovers into plastic containers near the kitchen. Everything looked normal on the surface, but underneath, the emotional pressure inside that room had become almost physical. Then the doors opened. At first, nobody paid much attention. Just another guest arriving late, I assumed. But something about the man stepping inside immediately changed the energy near the entrance. Tall, older, gray wool coat dusted lightly with snow, dark leather briefcase in one hand, serious expression, not grieving, focused. Pastor Reynolds greeted him quietly near the doorway. The man nodded once, then scanned the room carefully, searching. And when his eyes landed on me, my stomach tightened instantly, because I recognized him, Harold Bennett, Robert's attorney. For a second, I genuinely couldn't breathe. Harold and Robert had worked together for nearly 15 years. Estate paperwork, retirement planning, property documents. Harold had even attended our anniversary dinner 2 summers earlier. But why would he come here, today, at the funeral reception? Across the room, Emily noticed him almost immediately, and her entire body changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Her shoulders stiffened. The smile vanished from her face before she quickly forced it back. Michael followed her gaze. The second he saw Harold, the color drained from his face. That terrified me more than anything else, because Michael already knew who Harold was, and judging by his reaction, he knew exactly why Harold might be here.
The room slowly quieted as Harold removed his gloves and spoke briefly with Pastor Reynolds. Then he started walking toward me. Conversations lowered around him naturally, not because people recognized him specifically, because something about his presence felt official, serious. I stood slowly before he reached me. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat now. "Mrs. Hastings," Harold said gently. Not Diane, Mrs. Hastings. Formal, professional. His expression softened slightly. "I am very sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I whispered. Up close, I could see exhaustion in his eyes too. Not emotional exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man carrying responsibility. Behind him, I noticed Emily beginning to move toward us quickly, too quickly. Harold continued carefully. "Robert asked me to attend today personally." A strange silence spread outward through the room. Not total silence yet, but close. People nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Michael looked frozen near the buffet table. Emily reached his side instantly. "What is this?" she asked lightly, though her voice sounded tighter now. Harold turned politely. "Mrs. Carter." Emily smiled too fast. "If this is about paperwork, maybe another day would be more appropriate." Another day. Interesting. Harold's expression remained calm. "I'm here because Robert specifically instructed me otherwise." That sentence hit the room like a dropped glass. I saw Margaret slowly lower her coffee cup again. Frank Wilson folded his arms across his chest. Pastor Reynolds stopped speaking mid-conversation nearby. Even the church kitchen volunteers had gone quiet. Emily laughed softly, but it sounded strained now. "Well, I just don't think today is the time for legal discussions." Legal discussions. There it was. She knew. Maybe not details, but enough. Harold looked toward me directly. "Mrs. Hastings," he said carefully, "your husband left explicit written instructions regarding timing." My pulse thudded painfully. Written instructions. Suddenly I remembered every late-night conversation Robert avoided finishing. Every "I'll handle it tomorrow." Every quiet trip downtown. Every distracted silence over the past year. Michael stepped forward finally. "Mom's been through enough today," he said quietly. Enough. Not wrong, not inappropriate, not "why are you here?" Just enough. That told me everything. Harold studied him calmly, then asked one devastating question. "Did your father ever discuss his final wishes with you directly, Michael?"
The room went dead silent. Michael opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Emily instinctively. That tiny movement changed the entire atmosphere. People noticed. Oh, they noticed. Because suddenly my 50-year-old son looked less like a grieving son and more like a man waiting for permission to answer. Emily stepped in immediately. I really think we should respect Diane emotionally right now. Emotionally. Again positioning me as fragile, unstable, unable to handle reality. But something surprising happened then. Before I could speak, Margaret Lewis did. Diane seems perfectly capable to me. Calm voice, sharp tone. Several heads turned instantly. Emily blinked, caught off guard. Then Joanne Miller added quietly from nearby. If Robert left instructions, they should probably be respected. Another shift in the room, subtle, but powerful. For the first time all day, people were no longer just sympathizing with me privately. They were beginning to oppose Emily publicly. And Emily realized it. I saw panic flicker across her face for half a second before she recovered again. But now the mask had cracks everyone could see.
Harold cleared his throat gently. Robert anticipated this might be emotionally difficult, he said carefully. That sentence made my chest tighten. Anticipated. Robert anticipated conflict. Why? How long had he known? Harold slowly opened his briefcase. The sound alone seemed to freeze the room. Paper shifted softly inside. Michael's breathing visibly changed, quick, shallow. Emily gripped his wrist tightly enough that even he glanced down. I suddenly understood something horrifying. They weren't nervous about paperwork. They were nervous about specific paperwork. And somehow, deep down, they already knew Robert had changed something. Harold removed a large sealed envelope, cream-colored, my husband's handwriting across the front. For Diane. My vision blurred instantly. I hadn't seen Robert's handwriting since before the hospital. For a second, the entire room disappeared around me. All I could see was his name, his careful block lettering, his hands, his presence. Gone. Emily's voice cut sharply through the silence. What exactly is in that envelope? Too fast, too emotional, too revealing. Harold looked at her evenly. Instructions from your father-in-law. Michael swallowed hard. Nobody in the room moved now. Nobody even pretended not to watch anymore. Outside, snow hit the church window softly, while the fellowship hall stood frozen in silence around us. Then Harold turned toward me fully and asked, Mrs. Hastings, would now be an appropriate time to honor your husband's final request in front of the family? And the moment he said those words, Emily's face finally lost all color. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire fellowship hall stood frozen around Harold Bennett and that cream-colored envelope in his hands. Even the church kitchen volunteers had stopped stacking trays. I could hear the faint hum of the old refrigerator behind the serving counter, the soft ticking of the wall clock, snow tapping lightly against the windows, and underneath all of it, Emily's breathing, quick, uneven. For the first time since Robert died, my daughter-in-law looked genuinely afraid. Harold waited patiently beside me, one hand resting calmly on the envelope, professional, steady, like a man who understood exactly how heavy this moment was about to become. I looked down at Robert's handwriting again. For Diane. My vision blurred slightly. Robert always printed carefully. Even grocery lists looked formal when he wrote them. Suddenly, memories hit me all at once. Birthday cards, sticky notes beside the coffee maker. Drive safe. Don't forget your appointment. I love you, Di. 42 years of little handwritten pieces of love. Gone now, except for this. My chest tightened painfully. Mrs. Hastings? Harold asked gently. I realized the entire room was waiting for my answer. I swallowed carefully. If this is what Robert wanted, I said quietly, then yes. Emily stepped forward instantly. I really don't think. But Harold interrupted politely. With respect, Mrs. Carter, your father-in-law was very specific. Specific. That word landed heavily. Emily's face changed again, tiny cracks spraying wider now. What exactly is this? She asked. Still trying to sound calm, still trying to sound socially appropriate, but panic was creeping into her voice now, whether she wanted it there or not. Harold slowly removed several documents from the envelope. The sound of paper unfolding echoed unnaturally loud in the silent room. Michael stared at the floor. He hadn't looked directly at me in several minutes, and somehow that hurt more now than earlier.
Because I suddenly understood something devastating. My son already suspected what those papers contained. Harold adjusted his glasses carefully, then spoke. Approximately 6 months ago, Robert Hastings updated his estate documents and final directives. A ripple moved through the room, subtle gasps, shifted feet, quick glances. 6 months ago, exactly when Robert started acting distracted, exactly when he began taking those unexplained trips downtown. Emily's arms folded tightly across her chest. Michael rubbed his forehead slowly. Harold continued calmly.
Robert requested that these instructions be shared in the presence of immediate family should any dispute, confusion, or pressure arise following his passing. Pressure. The word hung heavily in the room. I saw several people glance toward Emily immediately. Her face flushed slightly. "No one's pressuring anyone," she said quickly. Too quickly. Harold simply nodded once. "I'm only repeating your father-in-law's written language." Silence again. Heavy silence. Then Harold looked directly at me. "Robert also included a personal handwritten letter addressed to you, Mrs. Hastings." That nearly broke me. Not the legal documents, the letter. Because suddenly Robert felt close again. Close enough to touch. Harold carefully unfolded a smaller sheet of paper. I recognized Robert's handwriting instantly. My knees almost weakened. And when Harold began reading, the entire room disappeared around me. To my wife, Diane. My throat tightened painfully. "If you're hearing this, then I'm already gone, and I know you're probably trying to stay strong for everyone else like you always do." A soft sound escaped somewhere behind me, someone crying quietly. Harold continued. "I spent 42 years beside the best woman I ever knew. Diane stood beside me when we had nothing, when we struggled, when we worked double shifts, when we buried our parents, when we raised our son, and when my health began failing." My eyes filled immediately. Across the room, Michael looked like he physically couldn't breathe anymore, and Emily had stopped pretending to smile entirely. She protected this family long before anyone appreciated what that truly cost her. The room stayed perfectly silent. Nobody shifted, nobody coughed, because suddenly Robert himself had entered the room through those words, and people were listening, really listening. Harold paused briefly before continuing. "I became increasingly concerned during the past year that Diane would not be properly protected after my death." Emily's head jerked up instantly. Michael closed his eyes, and that single reaction told everyone everything. Concerned. Robert had been concerned about his own family. The emotional atmosphere inside the fellowship hall changed completely then. No longer awkward, no longer uncertain. Now people understood. The whispers, the tension, the funeral humiliation. Robert had seen it too. Harold continued reading. "Because of those concerns, I made several final decisions very carefully." My heart pounded hard now. Across the room, Frank Wilson slowly sat down in one of the folding chairs, like even he needed support hearing this. Harold lifted the official documents next. "Per Robert Hastings' revised estate instructions," Emily suddenly interrupted, "Michael is his only son." The sentence burst out of her before she could stop herself. The room turned toward her instantly, and for the first time all day, Emily looked exposed, not polished, not composed, exposed. Harold remained calm. "Yes," he said evenly, and Robert addressed that specifically. Emily went completely still. Harold looked back down at the documents.
The marital residence, all primary savings accounts, retirement distributions, and the lake property in Michigan are to remain solely under the ownership and control of Diane Hastings. Complete silence. Pure silence. I actually heard someone drop a plastic fork near the dessert table. Emily blinked rapidly. Once. Twice. Like her brain physically couldn't process what she'd heard. Michael's face lost all remaining color. And suddenly I understood something else. This wasn't what they expected. Not even close. Harold continued calmly. "These assets are not to be transferred, sold, refinanced, or altered without Mrs. Hastings' direct written approval." Emily stared openly now, her mouth parted slightly. "But," she whispered, one tiny word, full panic underneath. Harold turned another page. Additionally, Robert established legal protections preventing outside financial influence or forced liquidation of the family home during Mrs. Hastings' lifetime. The room erupted into soft murmurs immediately. Not loud. Church people rarely become loud, but emotionally charged whispers swept across the fellowship hall like wind. Oh my God, he knew. That's why. Emily looked around quickly, realizing too late that public sympathy had completely shifted away from her now. Margaret Lewis folded her arms tightly across her chest. Frank Wilson stared directly at Michael with visible disappointment. Joanne Miller looked heartbroken, not for Emily, for me, because suddenly everyone understood what Robert had been trying to protect me from, my own family. Harold carefully lowered the documents, but he wasn't finished, I could tell. Emily could tell too, because her breathing had become visibly shallow now. What else? She asked quietly. Harold studied her for one long moment. Then he picked up the handwritten letter again. There is one final instruction. Nobody moved. Michael looked physically ill, and suddenly I pitied my son, not because he deserved it, because he looked like a man realizing too late exactly who he had become. Harold read slowly. If my wife is ever made to feel unwelcome, pressured, manipulated, or excluded within her own family after my death. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Then all shared financial access previously discussed with Michael Hastings shall be permanently revoked. The room went dead silent again. Even the air felt frozen. Michael's head snapped upward instantly. What? His voice cracked. Actually cracked. Harold calmly lifted another document. Those revisions were finalized and notarized 6 months ago. Michael looked stunned, completely stunned. You removed me, he whispered. Harold answered carefully. Your father adjusted access structures, yes. Emily suddenly stepped forward. This is insane. The mask was gone now, completely gone. This can't be legal. Her voice sounded sharp, emotional, desperate. Harold didn't react. It is fully legal. Emily looked at Michael wildly now. Say something, but Michael couldn't.
Because deep down, he knew why Robert did it. That was the devastating part. Nobody in that room looked shocked by Robert's reasoning anymore. Not after the funeral seating, not after the comments, not after the humiliation everyone had witnessed all day. The church hall had become a mirror, and Emily hated what it reflected back at her. Harold unfolded the final page carefully. One last sentence from Robert's personal letter. Nobody breathed. Diane, Harold read softly, if you're hearing all this today, then it means I was right to worry. Please remember this. You were never the burden in this family. You were the foundation. That broke something inside the room. Several women openly cried. Frank Wilson wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. Pastor Reynolds lowered his head. And me? I stood perfectly still. Because after hours of humiliation, after being pushed aside at my own husband's funeral, Robert had somehow reached across death itself to put me back where I belonged, at the center. Emily looked like she might collapse. Not dramatically. Worse. Quietly. Like someone realizing the entire room now saw her clearly for the first time. And Michael? My son finally looked at me directly. Really looked at me. His eyes filled slowly with shame. Not embarrassment. Shame. The kind that arrives too late to undo damage. Then came the moment that shattered whatever illusion Emily still had left. Margaret Lewis stood slowly from her chair and said into the silence, Robert knew exactly what he was doing. Nobody disagreed. Nobody defended Emily. Nobody defended Michael. Because the truth had already settled over the room completely. And for the first time all day, Emily stood alone. For several long seconds after Harold finished Robert's letter, nobody spoke. The fellowship hall stood frozen in the kind of silence that changes relationships permanently. Not awkward silence. Not grieving silence. Truth silence. The kind that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they misjudged someone. Or worse, when they judged correctly and stayed quiet anyway. I stood beside the memorial table with Robert's letter trembling faintly in my hands. I still hadn't fully processed hearing his words out loud. You were never the burden in this family. You were the foundation. That sentence kept echoing through me. 42 years together. And somehow my husband had still found one final way to protect me after he was gone. Across the room, Emily looked completely different now. Smaller. Not physically. Socially. Emotionally. The confidence she'd carried all afternoon had collapsed so quietly it almost seemed unreal. Just an hour earlier, she'd moved through the room like a woman managing a family event. Now she stood stiff beside Michael while people carefully avoided meeting her eyes. That was the first consequence. Not anger. Distance. And in church communities, distance says everything. Nobody rushed to comfort her. Nobody reassured her. Nobody laughed at her nervous little smiles anymore. The room had shifted. Completely. I watched Emily glance around slowly, like she was searching for someone to pull her back into emotional safety. But every face she found looked uncertain now, or disappointed, or quietly disturbed.
Even the women who'd spent all morning complimenting her arrangements and organization had moved away, toward me. Joanne Miller touched my arm gently first. "Oh, Diane." That was all she said, but her voice carried heartbreak inside it. Margaret Lewis stepped beside her, expression tight with anger she was trying hard to contain. "That poor man," she muttered softly. I knew immediately she meant Robert. Not because he died, because he saw this coming. That realization hit everyone differently now. Robert hadn't acted irrationally. He'd acted protectively. And suddenly, every uncomfortable moment from the funeral replayed differently in people's minds. The front row humiliation, the comments about the house, the pressure, the controlling behavior, all of it now looked darker, more intentional. I saw the realization spreading slowly across faces throughout the hall, like dominoes falling quietly. Meanwhile, Michael still hadn't moved. My son stood near the buffet table, staring at the floor, while Harold calmly returned documents to his briefcase. People glanced at Michael now with something I never imagined I'd see directed toward my child. Disappointment. Not loud, not dramatic, just visible, painfully visible. Frank Wilson approached him first. "Your father loved your mother deeply," Frank said quietly. Michael nodded faintly. But Frank didn't walk away immediately. Instead, he added, "You should have protected her today." The sentence landed hard enough that even I felt it physically. Michael's eyes closed briefly, like the truth hurt too much to hear spoken aloud. But nobody defended him, because nobody could, not after what everyone witnessed. Emily stepped closer to Michael immediately. "Frank," she said carefully, "today is already emotional enough." Frank turned toward her slowly, and for the first time all day, someone looked at Emily without politeness. Not cruelly, worse, honestly. "You're right," he replied calmly. "It is." Then he walked away. Emily stood completely still afterward. No comeback, no smile, nothing. Because manipulative people survive on social cooperation, and that cooperation was disappearing from the room piece by piece. I remained quiet. That seemed to disturb Emily more than anything else. I wasn't crying publicly, wasn't attacking her, wasn't creating a scene. I simply stood there calmly holding Robert's letter while the truth unfolded around her naturally. And somehow, that silence made everything heavier. Pastor Reynolds approached me slowly. His eyes looked full. "Diane," he said softly, "Robert was a wise man." I nodded carefully. "He worried too much." Pastor Reynolds gave me a sad look. "No," he replied gently. "I think he worried exactly enough." That sentence settled deep inside me, because part of me still wanted to believe this entire day had been misunderstanding. Grief, stress, poor judgment. But Robert had seen the pattern long before I did. That truth hurt more than the humiliation itself. Nearby, Emily suddenly laughed nervously at something nobody else reacted to. The sound echoed awkwardly through the room. Too sharp, too forced. Several people glanced toward her briefly before returning their attention elsewhere. That's when I realized something else. Emily wasn't used to social rejection. Not real rejection.
She was beautiful, polished, articulate, the kind of woman who usually controlled how people saw her. But church communities have long memories, and older women especially notice character beneath presentation.
Once they sense cruelty toward a vulnerable person, everything changes. I saw it happening in real time now. Joanne brought me tea. Carol Bennett found me a chair. Margaret quietly gathered my coat before I even asked. Simple things, small gestures, but every one of them carried meaning. Meanwhile, Emily stood increasingly alone near the opposite side of the hall. Not abandoned completely, just emotionally separated, like people no longer trusted standing too close to her. At one point, Ava wandered over innocently holding a paper napkin. "Grandma," she said softly to me, "are you okay?" My throat tightened instantly. Sweet 16-year-old Ava, caught in the middle of adult ugliness she didn't fully understand yet. I touched her cheek gently. "I'm all right, sweetheart." She hesitated, then quietly asked something that nearly shattered the room again. "Why were you sitting by yourself upstairs?" Silence spread immediately nearby. Emily stiffened across the hall. Michael looked physically ill. Because children ask the questions adults avoid, and there was no good answer. I smiled softly at Ava. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. I said it gently, truthfully, and somehow that hurt Michael more than anger would have, because he looked at me then with eyes full of something close to shame-induced grief, like he finally understood the size of his failure. Not legal failure, moral failure. Emily crossed the room quickly. "Ava, honey, why don't you help me pack up desserts?" Too fast, too controlling. Ava looked confused but obeyed. As she walked away, I noticed several church women exchange glances. Not subtle glances anymore, knowing ones. Emily noticed them too, and her composure slipped again. Tiny crack, tiny twitch near her mouth, tiny tremble in her hands. People were seeing her now, really seeing her. The rest of the reception unfolded strangely after that. Nobody officially confronted Emily, nobody raised voices, but socially, everything had changed. Conversations died when she approached. People answered politely but briefly. Even Michael's cousins kept distance now. I overheard one whisper quietly near the coat rack. Robert protected Diane from his own son. The other cousin replied softly, "That says everything." Emily heard that too. I know she did because she immediately turned away pretending not to, but her face had gone pale again. As guests slowly began leaving due to worsening snow outside, many stopped directly beside me before exiting. Not Emily, me. They hugged me, touched my shoulder, praised Robert, told stories about our marriage. One older man even whispered, "He knew your worth." And every interaction isolated Emily further without anyone intentionally trying to. That's the thing about social truth. Once it surfaces, people reorganize themselves around it naturally. Eventually, only a handful of people remained inside the fellowship hall. The church volunteers, Pastor Reynolds, Margaret, Frank, Michael, Emily, and me. Harold had already left after quietly giving me additional paperwork and his personal number. Before leaving, he said one final thing softly enough that only I heard it. "Robert was very clear that you were never to be pressured." Never to be pressured. Meaning Robert expected pressure from his own family. That realization still hurt in ways I couldn't fully explain. Michael finally approached me near the doorway, while Emily stood several feet behind him, watching, always watching. But this time Michael didn't look toward her before speaking. "Mom." His voice cracked immediately. I looked at him calmly. He looked exhausted, destroyed, honestly. Not because of inheritance, because his father's final words had exposed him publicly. "I didn't know," he whispered. I believed him, partly. I don't think Michael knew specifics, but he knew enough. Enough to stay silent when Emily humiliated me. Enough to avoid asking questions he didn't want answered. Enough to choose comfort over courage. And now everybody knew it. I studied my son quietly, then asked the only question that mattered. "When she moved me out of the front row today," his eyes filled instantly, "did you agree with it?" Silence. Long silence. Michael opened his mouth twice, before finally whispering, "I should have stopped it. Not no, not never. I should have stopped it." And somehow that answer hurt worse, because it was honest. Behind him, Emily suddenly spoke sharply. "Michael, we should go." Nobody acknowledged her. Not even him.
That may have been the moment she finally understood how completely the room had turned against her. Not loudly, not cruelly, socially, emotionally, permanently. Then came the final humiliation. Small, simple, devastating. Pastor Reynolds approached me carrying Robert's folded American flag from the funeral service. Traditionally, it should have gone through immediate family presentation protocols, but instead, he placed it directly into my hands and said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Your husband would want this with you. Not Michael, not Emily, me." The silence afterward nearly swallowed the room whole, because everybody understood what that gesture meant. Emily's eyes lowered immediately, and for the very first time all day, she looked like an outsider in my family instead of me. The house was completely silent when I unlocked the front door that night. Not peaceful silent, empty silent. The kind of silence that settles into walls after a funeral. I stood there for several seconds without moving, one hand still gripping my purse. Snow melting slowly off my coat onto the hardwood floor Robert had installed himself 27 years earlier. I could still picture him kneeling there with measuring tape clipped to his belt. Patient, careful, determined to make this house feel permanent, safe, home. And suddenly the exhaustion hit me all at once. Not just physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. The kind that settles deep into your bones after spending an entire day holding yourself together in front of people. I closed the door quietly behind me. The soft click echoed through the house. For the first time all day, no one was watching me. No one was evaluating my reactions. No one was pretending. It was just me now, and Robert's memory. I slipped off my shoes slowly near the entryway, and noticed his old winter boots still sitting exactly where he'd left them before the hospital. My chest tightened instantly. I hadn't moved them. Couldn't. Some part of me still expected him to walk through the kitchen doorway asking why I was standing there in my coat looking so sad. I moved carefully through the dark living room and turned on the lamp beside Robert's chair. Warm yellow light spread softly across the room.
His chair, still angled slightly toward mine the way it had been every evening for years. The Afghan blanket folded neatly across the armrest. His reading glasses still resting on the side table beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. 3 letters missing from the final answer. Robert hated leaving puzzles unfinished. I stared at it for a long moment before finally lowering myself slowly into my own chair across from his. And for the first time since morning, I let myself breathe. Really breathe. The house smelled faintly like cedar wood and coffee, like him. Outside, snow continued falling quietly against the windows, while the grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily through the silence. I should have felt devastated, humiliated, broken after everything that happened. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Not happy, not victorious, just clear. Because for months, maybe years, something inside me had sensed the shift happening in my family. The distance, the careful exclusions, the subtle humiliations wrapped inside polite smiles. But today, stripped all of it bare. There was no confusion left anymore. Emily had exposed herself. Not because I fought her, because I didn't. That was the part I kept returning to. I never yelled, never argued, never begged for respect. I simply let her keep talking. And eventually, people heard her, really heard her. I closed my eyes briefly and remembered the moment at church when she told the staff member the front row was for immediate family only. The silence afterward, the way people looked away awkwardly, the way Michael stared at the floor instead of defending me. At the time, the humiliation felt unbearable. But now I understood something important.
Cruel people often reveal themselves most clearly when they think nobody will challenge them. Emily thought she controlled the room. She thought I would stay small, quiet, powerless. Instead, she kept speaking until everyone finally saw exactly who she was. And the most devastating part? I didn't have to destroy her reputation. She did it herself. I leaned my head back against the chair and stared at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed slowly through my mind. Margaret defending me, Pastor Reynolds handing me Robert's flag, Frank telling Michael he should have protected me, the church ladies quietly surrounding me while Emily stood alone across the room pretending not to notice. Small moments, but together, they changed everything. Not legally, emotionally, socially. The kind of consequences that linger long after paperwork stops mattering. I looked toward Robert's empty chair again. "You knew," I whispered softly. And deep down, I think he did. That realization still hurt, because it meant Robert had seen enough warning signs before he died to worry about what would happen to me afterward. What must that have felt like for him?
The way he always noticed when I felt left out at parties and quietly brought conversations back toward me. Robert protected people gently. That was who he was. And somehow, even after death, he protected me one final time. A sudden knock at the front door startled me. I froze instantly. At this hour, another knock came, softer this time. I stood slowly and walked toward the entryway, tightening my robe around myself. When I opened the door, Michael stood there alone. Snow dusted his shoulders. His face looked exhausted, older somehow. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "I didn't know where else to go." The sentence hurt immediately, because once upon a time, this house was the first place he ran whenever life frightened him. I stepped aside silently. He entered slowly, removing his coat awkwardly, like a nervous teenager again, not a 50-year-old man. My son glanced around the living room, at his father's chair, at the lamp still glowing softly beside it, at the flag folded carefully on the table. His eyes filled almost instantly. "I keep hearing Dad's words," he admitted quietly. I didn't answer right away, because honestly, so did I. Michael sat carefully on the couch across from me. For several moments, all we heard was the ticking clock. Then he whispered, "She shouldn't have treated you like that." There it was. Not a full apology, but the beginning of truth. I looked at him calmly. "You let her." His face crumpled slightly, not dramatically, just honestly. "I know." The room fell silent again. I studied my son carefully then, and suddenly I saw him differently tonight. Not as Emily's husband, not as the little boy I raised, just a tired middle-aged man who spent years choosing comfort over courage until it cost him his father's respect. That's a painful thing for any son to carry. "I loved your father," he whispered suddenly. The statement sounded defensive somehow, as though he needed me to believe it. "I know you did," I answered softly. His eyes filled harder after that, because love without loyalty leaves scars too. Michael rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "She's angry," he admitted. I almost laughed softly at the understatement. Instead, I simply asked, "About the inheritance?" He nodded weakly. Then after a long pause, "She said Dad humiliated us publicly." "Us. Interesting." I studied him carefully. "Did he?" Michael couldn't answer, because deep down, he knew the humiliation didn't begin with Robert's letter. It began the moment his wife pushed his grieving mother out of the front row at her own husband's funeral, and he stood there silently. Michael stared at the floor for a long time before speaking again. I should have said something upstairs. Not should have stopped her. Not should have disagreed. Should have said something. That was the tragedy of weak men. Sometimes their silence hurts more than cruelty.
I looked toward Robert's chair again. He gave you opportunities today, I said quietly. Michael's face tightened immediately because he understood exactly what I meant. Robert gave him opportunities even before dying, opportunities to protect me, to defend me, to prove his father wrong, and he failed every single one. Tears finally slid down Michael's face then. Real tears, not polished funeral tears. Shame, grief, regret. I don't know how to fix this, he whispered. I believed him, because some moments in families become permanent. You can apologize later, you can regret later, but people never fully forget who stood beside them when they were publicly humiliated.
I leaned back slowly in my chair. For the first time all day, I no longer felt invisible. That feeling surprised me most. All afternoon, Emily tried making me smaller, less important, less central, a burden, an afterthought. But sitting here in the home Robert built with his own hands, holding the flag from his funeral, listening to my son finally confront the consequences of his silence, I realized something quietly powerful. I had never lost my place in this family. They had simply forgotten who I was. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the neighborhood while the house glowed warm around us. Michael eventually stood near midnight to leave. At the door, he hesitated awkwardly, then quietly asked, "Can I come by tomorrow?" I looked at him for a long moment, then answered honestly, "I don't know yet." The truth visibly hurt him, but I think he respected it too. After he left, I locked the door gently and returned to the living room. I sat down beside Robert's chair one final time that night. The clock ticked softly. The snow kept falling, and for the first time since the funeral, the house no longer felt lonely. It felt protected. I looked toward Robert's unfinished crossword puzzle and smiled through tears. Emily thought public humiliation would break me. Instead, she kept talking long enough for everyone else to finally hear the truth. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't screaming back. It's staying calm long enough for people to expose themselves.